4 million barrels every single day. That is how much Canadian oil moves through pipelines into the United States, feeding refineries, powering factories, heating homes, fueling the vehicles of millions of ordinary Americans who have never once thought about where their energy comes from or what would happen if the pipes carrying it were suddenly under political scrutiny. This morning, Donald Trump made them think about it. Carney made sure Washington thought about something else entirely. Energy is not like other trade commodities. You can find alternative suppliers for steel, you can find alternative markets for soybeans, you can reroute payment systems and redirect shipping lanes and rebuild procurement portfolios over months of careful planning. But 4 million barrels of oil per day is not a supply line you replace with a phone call and a new contract. It is physical infrastructure, pipelines, refineries, distribution networks, processing facilities built over decades specifically to handle Canadian crude and integrated into the American energy system at a depth that no tariff, no trade directive, and no political decision can quickly undo. When Donald Trump placed Canadian oil supply under political review this morning, he did not reach for an economic lever. He reached for the physical foundation of American energy security and began questioning what it would cost to control it. What Carney fired back within hours demonstrated something that every energy analyst, every refinery operator, and every pipeline executive in North America already understood, but that Washington appeared to have never fully calculated. The pipes run in both directions, and the person who decides how much flows through them is not the one who needs the oil. It is the one who owns it. At 8:07 this morning, the White House released an executive memorandum directing the Department of Energy and the Department of the Interior to conduct an immediate strategic review of American dependence on Canadian oil imports. The memorandum described the current level of American reliance on Canadian crude as an unacceptable concentration of energy supply risk in a single foreign source, subject to the trade and political policies of a foreign government. It directed the review to assess alternative domestic and international supply sources capable of replacing Canadian imports within a 24-month timeline. It directed the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to examine whether existing pipeline infrastructure and import terminal capacity could be reconfigured to receive non-Canadian crude at volumes sufficient to reduce Canadian supply dependence below 30% of total American crude imports. The memorandum was careful in its language. It did not announce a ban on Canadian oil imports. It did not impose new tariffs on Canadian crude. It did not shut down any existing pipeline or supply arrangement. What it did was place the entire question of Canadian oil supply into the category of a strategic vulnerability requiring active management and potential reduction. In the language of energy markets and supply chain planning, that framing carries consequences that do not require any immediate operational action to produce. The moment a government formally classifies a supply relationship as a strategic vulnerability, it signals to every market participant, every alternative supplier, every pipeline operator, and every financial institution with exposure to that supply chain that the relationship is under review and may be restructured. Markets do not wait for restructuring to begin before they start pricing the risk of it. The American energy industry's reaction was immediate and visceral. Refinery operators across the Midwest, the Gulf Coast, and the Northeast, who have built their processing operations around Canadian crude, began making urgent calls to the Department of Energy, requesting clarification about the review's scope and timeline. The specific concern was operational and concrete. Canadian crude, particularly the heavy oil that flows from Alberta's oil sands, is chemically distinct from the light sweet crude produced in American shale fields and imported from Middle Eastern sources. American refineries that have been configured to process Canadian heavy crude have invested billions of dollars in specialized equipment and processes optimized for that specific type of oil. Replacing Canadian supply is not simply a matter of finding another country that produces oil. It requires either finding a country that produces chemically similar heavy crude in equivalent volumes or spending billions more to reconfigure refinery infrastructure to process different types of crude. Neither option is available on a 24-month timeline at 4 million barrels per day. Here is the foundational reality that the administration's memorandum revealed it had not fully incorporated into its strategic assessment. The United States needs Canadian oil more immediately and more operationally than Canada needs American customers for that oil. That statement runs counter to the intuitive assumption that a smaller economy is always more dependent on a larger one. But energy markets do not operate on the logic of economic size. They operate on the logic of physical infrastructure, chemical compatibility, geographic proximity, and the decades of industrial investment that have made specific supply relationships structurally embedded in ways that cannot be extracted without enormous cost and significant time. Canada exports approximately 4 million barrels per day to the United States. That represents roughly 60% of total American crude oil imports. The refineries receiving that oil are not generic facilities that can switch suppliers like a restaurant switches vegetable vendors. They are specialized industrial operations whose entire processing architecture has been engineered around Canadian crude specifications. The Midwest refining complex, sometimes called the PADD 2 region, is the most concentrated example. Refineries in Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Indiana process Canadian crude almost exclusively. They are landlocked facilities with no access to ocean tanker terminals that could receive alternative supplies from distant producers. Their pipelines connect north to Canadian supply. They have no southern connections of sufficient capacity to receive Gulf Coast crude at volumes that could substitute for Canadian imports. This is the reality that Carney's team had documented, analyzed, and prepared to use as the foundation of Canada's response months before this morning's memorandum arrived. At 2:51 this afternoon, Mark Carney appeared before reporters in Ottawa. He had spent the hours between the morning memorandum and his afternoon statement in what Canadian government sources described as a focused and entirely calm series of conversations. Not crisis calls, activation calls. The calls you make when a contingency plan transitions from preparation to execution. When he walked to the podium, he carried nothing. No document, no binder, no notes. He had committed everything he was about to say to memory because he had been preparing to say it for months. He opened by acknowledging the American memorandum directly. He said Canada had reviewed it carefully and understood its intent completely. He said Canada's response was built on a single foundational principle that he wanted to state clearly before explaining the specific measures Canada was implementing. The principle was this: Canadian oil is a Canadian resource. Its export is a Canadian decision. The terms on which it flows, the volume at which it flows, the price at which it is sold, and the customers to whom it is directed are determined by Canadian law, Canadian regulatory frameworks, and Canadian national interest. No foreign government's strategic review changes that principle. What a foreign government's strategic review does change is Canada's assessment of the reliability of that foreign government as a long-term energy customer. And Canada's response to an unreliable customer is the same as any supplier's response. It finds better ones. Then he announced 4 specific measures that Canada was implementing immediately. The first was the activation of Canada's Energy Export Sovereignty Protocol. This was a regulatory framework that Natural Resources Canada and the Canada Energy Regulator had developed over the previous 4 months specifically for this scenario. Under the protocol, all existing export authorizations for Canadian crude oil destined for the United States were placed under an immediate 90-day strategic review. During that review period, export volumes would continue at current levels, but at the conclusion of the review, export authorizations would be renewed, modified, or restructured based on Canada's assessment of whether the existing arrangements adequately served Canadian national energy interests. Carney said the review would consider the pricing terms of existing export arrangements, the degree to which American trade policy actions had affected Canadian energy sector revenues, and whether the current volume and destination structure of Canadian oil exports represented the optimal use of a finite Canadian resource. The second measure was the announcement that Canada had reached preliminary agreement with 3 Asia-Pacific nations on the accelerated development of Western Canadian oil export infrastructure. Japan, South Korea, and China had agreed to participate in a joint financing arrangement for the expansion of Canadian Pacific Coast export terminal capacity. The expansion, if completed on the announced timeline, would add export capacity of approximately 1.5 million barrels per day accessible to Asia-Pacific markets. Carney said Canada had been in discussions about Pacific export infrastructure expansion for years. The current state of the bilateral relationship with the United States had accelerated those discussions considerably. Customers who treat supply relationships as strategic vulnerabilities to be managed and reduced do not inspire confidence in suppliers considering long-term infrastructure investment decisions. The third measure was a formal notification to the United States Department of Energy that Canada was initiating a review of the existing regulatory framework governing pipeline exports to the United States under the Canadian Energy Regulator Act. The review would examine whether current pipeline export license terms adequately reflected Canadian national interests given the current state of the bilateral trade relationship. Carney said this review was a normal exercise of Canadian regulatory authority. He noted that the United States government had just completed its own review of Canadian energy supply dependence. Canada was simply conducting a parallel review from its own perspective. The symmetry was deliberate, and the message it carried was precise. If the United States is reviewing its dependence on Canadian oil, Canada is reviewing the terms on which it supplies it. The fourth measure was the announcement that the Canada Growth Fund, a federal investment vehicle with a mandate to support Canadian clean and conventional energy development, had been directed to accelerate its investment in Canadian energy processing capacity. The goal was to increase the proportion of Canadian crude that is refined and processed inside Canada before export. Currently, most Canadian crude is exported in raw form and refined in American facilities. Increasing domestic Canadian refining capacity would capture more of the value chain inside Canada while reducing the volume of raw crude exports subject to American political review. The energy markets did not deliberate, they moved. West Texas intermediate crude oil prices rose more than 4% within 90 minutes of Carney's statement as traders calculated the supply implications of Canadian export license reviews and the strategic reorientation of Canadian pipeline infrastructure toward Pacific markets. American Midwest refinery stocks fell sharply as investors assessed the operational and financial consequences of potential Canadian supply disruption for facilities with no viable alternative supply source. Pipeline company stocks moved in both directions depending on their geographic exposure. Companies with Canadian crude transport exposure fell. Companies with potential alternative routing capacity rose modestly on speculative demand. The political reaction inside the United States was faster and more intense than any previous response to a Canadian countermeasure in this trade confrontation. The reason was geography and industry concentration. The Midwest refining complex is not an abstraction. It is a collection of facilities in specific congressional districts represented by specific senators and representatives who received very specific phone calls from very specific industry executives within hours of Carney's statement. The message in those calls was consistent and urgent. The Canadian Export License Review is not a diplomatic gesture. It is an operational threat to facilities that have no alternative supply. If Canadian crude volumes are reduced, Midwestern refineries face operational disruptions that translate directly into fuel supply tightness, price increases at the pump, and job losses in communities that have nothing to do with trade policy decisions made in Washington. Several Republican senators from affected Midwestern states released statements before the end of the business day expressing concern about the energy supply implications of the administration's memorandum and calling for immediate diplomatic engagement with Canada on the energy file. The political pressure that Canada's strategists had consistently calculated would be the most effective instrument for changing Washington's approach was arriving again, this time from an industry and a set of congressional districts where the operational consequences of Canadian countermeasures were immediate, visible, and politically impossible to ignore. Let me give you 3 scenarios for what happens next. In the first scenario, the combination of Midwest refinery industry pressure and the operational reality of the supply dependency forces the administration to narrow the scope of its energy review within 30 days. Energy Department officials acknowledge privately that the 24-month alternative supply timeline is operationally unrealistic at 4 million barrels per day. The administration signals willingness to discuss energy cooperation through commercial channels without strategic review framing attached. Canada pauses its export license review pending improvement in the broader bilateral relationship. The Pacific export infrastructure discussions continue as a permanent feature of Canada's long-term energy strategy, regardless of how the American dispute resolves. In the second scenario, both sides proceed with their respective reviews simultaneously. Canadian export license terms are renegotiated to include provisions that better reflect Canadian national interest, including pricing adjustments and volume flexibility mechanisms. American refineries begin paying more for Canadian crude as the commercial terms of supply arrangements are updated to reflect the current state of the bilateral relationship. The cost increase is passed through to American consumers at the pump. The political consequences of higher energy prices accelerate the pressure on the administration to resolve the broader trade confrontation. Negotiations begin within 60 days, with energy supply the central organizing issue around which both sides finally find enough mutual interest to produce a framework agreement. In the third scenario, the Pacific Export Infrastructure Expansion Canada, announced today, becomes the most consequential long-term outcome of this entire trade confrontation. As terminal capacity on Canada's Pacific coast increases over the following years, Canadian crude has genuine commercial alternatives to American refinery customers. For the first time in the history of the supply relationship, the structural leverage that American refineries have historically held over Canadian producers by being the only practical destination for landlocked Alberta crude is permanently reduced. Canada's negotiating position in every future energy discussion with the United States is permanently enhanced. The trade confrontation that began with tariff arguments ends by transforming the physical geography of North American energy in ways that will define the relationship for a generation. 4 million barrels every single day. That number has been the invisible foundation of American energy security for decades. It has flowed so reliably, so consistently, and so quietly through pipelines that most Americans have never needed to think about it. Donald Trump made them think about it this morning by placing it under strategic review. Carney made Washington think about something more important this afternoon. What happens to American refineries, American fuel prices, and American energy security if the country that owns those 4 million barrels decides that an unreliable customer deserves less reliable supply? Tonight, refinery operators are updating their supply contingency models. Pipeline companies are revising their infrastructure investment assumptions. Energy traders on 3 continents are recalculating their market positions. Midwest senators are drafting letters to the White House about constituent impacts. And in Ottawa, the team that prepared Canada's energy sovereignty response months before this morning's memorandum arrived is watching Washington discover that the most powerful lever in this trade war was never in American hands. It was always in Canadian ones.